My game of the day from round 1 of the Tata Steel Masters Tournament is Pavel Eljanov against Richard Rapport. And what a fascinating clash of styles this is. We have Eljanov, 33 years old, been playing very well over the past couple of years, rated 15 in the world, and he has quite an orthodox style, very positionally responsible. And he's playing against Rapport, who plays moves like this. On the 4th move, G5 already. You know, he's one of the few top players to lash out in this manner. Incredibly, he's actually played in exactly this way before. And Eljanov follows this previous game for 11 moves. Let's see what happened. Well, first of all, I like the way that Eljanov reacts. He doesn't overreact, actually. You know, you can't refute moves like this straight away. The problems often come later on. So first of all, Eljanov just keeps things steady. You know, just develops very simply. So he's played d3, the pawn is now attacked. That gets defended. Simple development. Now h4. Well, I like this move a lot because it basically clears up the situation on the king side. You know, black does not want to exchange here because that leaves him with an isolated pawn. White is doing fine there. So really, black has to push, but to some extent that rather blocks the king side. So that makes it potentially more secure for the king on this side of the board. And remember, when pawns advance, they leave big gaps behind the pawns, and positionally that can be problematic. Well, let's see what happens. e3, now the queen threatens the pawn, and that drags up the second pawn. So black is taking on a great responsibility. Pawns can't move backwards, and they leave a lot of weak squares behind them. So the knight just reroutes and starts to unravel white's position, and yes, of course, enables white to push forward in the centre, a standard reaction when black is playing on the wing. Looks fine. This pawn is attacked, b6, and up till here they're following a previous game that Rapport played, Abramovich against Rapport, played a couple of years ago. And there white played a d5, but this, I think, this is what black wants, because after bishop takes knight, then we have a position which is rather similar to the Nimzo-Indian in structure. And here black certainly has decent play, particularly after this exchange of bishops, very similar to the Nimzo, where this knight is looking at a couple of weakened squares, and black certainly has decent position there. But very quickly, Eljanov played differently. He simply castled. Good move. So the king is pretty safe on the king side as these pawns are blocked. Black castled. And now queen e2. So Eljanov just developing simply. And now e5 by Rapport. Don't have to push with e5. Maybe bishop b7. But e5, well, still lunging forward. And rook d1. Very simple. Remember that black can't take anything on d4 because of the pin on this diagonal. That bishop is superb here. Pawn takes. Now, white could recapture. As I said, doesn't have to fear this pawn being captured again. But this would give black a chance to roll forward, and black does have some play in this position. But instead of recapturing, Eljanov played a very clever move. He simply threw his knight into the middle. Excellent move. So now there's a threat to exchange on e7, and the rook is hanging in the corner. Very complicated position. But here I think Rapport's made a mistake. He played d3, giving the pawn back, but I think he should have played bishop a6, which looks very interesting for a start because it's on the same diagonal as the queen. If this pawn is captured in the middle, then at least this bishop can be blocked out. I mean, this might well be white's best continuation. And it also offers white the chance to take that rook in the corner. But black must have decent compensation here, because potentially these light squares around the king are very weak. And two bishops, a pretty active position. So I think bishop a6 is still incredibly complicated, but it seems to me that's the way to go. But d3 was played. Queen takes. Now, Rapport did this in order to play e4. He was clearly worried about that bishop and wanted to lock it out of the game. Now, knight takes knight. Now, if queen takes knight, then queen d5 wins a piece through the check. So knight takes force. Now, here's a very interesting moment. I have a feeling that Rapport was probably tempted to go into this variation, this whole line, because he'd probably been analysing the details of this pawn sacrifice. If this is taken, then black certainly has decent play after this clever move, bishop e5. Now, the rook should not take the pawn because it's going to be trapped by king g7, and eventually the rook will be trapped. So the rook has to come back, and then bishop e6, and suddenly black's pieces look very active indeed, compared to, these bishops look awful compared to black's bishops. So Eljanov looked at that position for around about 15 minutes, and obviously tempting to take a pawn, but very prudently he just stepped back with the queen. Good move. And after bishop a6, knight d4. Very good move. Now, this starts white's unravelling on the queen side, so this prepares to bring the bishop into play on one of these diagonals, and then that is a pretty weak pawn on d6. So somehow black needs to play. So Rapport swung his knight round, put it into e5. Well, obviously this looks like a great square, looking at these potential outposts. But nice move from Eljanov, knight e2. So this knight would like to come around perhaps to f4. Now that would cover the d3 square. And then white can start building up on the d file, maybe doubling rooks on the d file. And that pawn is very weak. There are lots of weak squares in black's position. Suddenly the downside of these pawn advances is evident. So Rapport threw the knight into d3. So he's still fighting. Now here, well, after the exchange of bishops, of course, here one might imagine knight f4, very simple continuation. Might imagine that could be a good idea. And I think it's not a bad way for white to play. That would force an exchange. And again, this pawn is potentially weak, so white could look at doubling on the d file, obviously after moving the rook, then doubling on the d file, or maybe rook d2. But black does potentially have play there. Maybe could threaten to get in e3 at some point. Maybe b5 is possible to break down white's control of the centre. White is certainly better there, so it's a tempting continuation. But instead, Eljanov went for this. Knight d4, threatening knight e6. And then he simply sacrificed an exchange. He simply gave this up. Difference in this position is that this bishop is flying down the diagonal. But also there is zero counterplay for black, or practically zero counterplay. It's very difficult for black to get play here. These rooks are really stymied. And I can understand why Eljanov went for this, because his position is so solid. Let's see how things went. Well, bishop b7, I think that's a good move because this bishop is so powerful. So this was exchanged. And now knight e2. You can't take on f5 because queen f3 suddenly. That is very annoying. So knight e2. Good move, this knight preparing to perhaps swing round to f4 and perhaps just clearing the d file as well. But I think this is a really important moment in the game, and this is where I think things went wrong for black. Black is still in the game here. This looks like a better move to me. Queen e4. Now, obviously, black would like an exchange of queens. White only has a knight and a pawn for the rook, so an exchange of queens is definitely desirable. Now, obviously, this gives another pawn to white. But queen e5 would either knock the queen all the way back to d1, but then black could use the d file, or exchanges queens. Doesn't make any odds. The queen can check, but then queen g7 and black gets the queens off because there's a threat here. So white's best is probably just to go along with the exchange of queens, but to play rook d1 and keep control of the d file. But here at least black can get his rooks into play. Now an exchange of rooks definitely desirable for black. So let's say rook takes h6, and now the rook comes into play, and black takes here. Now, white has knight and 2 pawns against a rook, and a solid position, so white is definitely better here, and very active rook. White has winning chances, but I think black is in the game here. There is potential to break up these pawns and get the next rook into play. This still needs to be controlled by white. So I think queen e4, that looks like the move to. Instantly, if queen e4 and if white doesn't take on d6 and plays queen d2, then d5 also gets the rooks into play. So for example, pawn takes, then rook c8, threatening rook c2, or if instead queen d5 check, then once again rook c8 gets an open file for the rook. But instead Rapport played rook f6, and I think this plays into white's hands because suddenly that knight is really menacing. The rooks are split, they don't have open files, this knight is coming into d5 and just looks a monster. Eljanov declines the exchange of queens. Good move. Rook c8, so he's looking to break open with b5, but no. Of course, Eljanov squashes that possibility straight away with a4. Excellent move. And those rooks, they're split. They're not working together. They don't have decent files to play on. And now white is just building up beautifully. There are no weaknesses in white's position at all. And this is a miserable position for black. Queen c2, possibility to play rook d4 to trap the queen. So for example, rook c6, rook d4, and suddenly the queen's in trouble. Rapport played a6. Now in fact, Eljanov could still play rook d4 here, and if b5, now watch out, this isn't a threat because queen takes knight. But after queen d3, now you're threatening rook f4. And in fact, this should be winning for white with this threat. But running a little short of time, Eljanov just played very practically after a6. Instead of analysing variations which might not work after rook d4, he just hacked this pawn off after 13 seconds. Very pragmatic. Basically, he's just taking another pawn. He doesn't disturb his position in any way. He takes no risks at all. Very good decision. And after this, he keeps the queens on. Again, another excellent move, because he knows that that queen holds everything together. It works beautifully with the knight, and black can do nothing here. Rook d4, again declining the exchange of queens. Excellent move. And there is simply no way through for black's heavy pieces. Knight d5, 1. I mean, this is... white's position is like an oil tanker. You can't hit it at all. Just a fantastic position. And there are too many weaknesses. This is weak. This is weak. This pawn is weak. You know, white is going to play rook d5, knight b5, maybe knight d4. I mean, everything is under fire here. And in fact, after this move, well, the time control had been reached, and here Rapport resigned. The queen moves back, and well, you can... I think this one is probably the best pawn to take, but that's 3 pawns, and white has still a completely impregnable position. Well, what a superb performance from Eljanov. Reacted so coolly to Rapport's early aggression and thoroughly deserved that victory.